All right, it's been, I know, probably a few weeks since the last podcast. I'm not going to speak for you, Martin. I've been very busy. My God, I've never been so busy, and I'm sure you've been busy. I don't know how you could be busy lying in the sun in Hawke's Bay, but I'm sure you're doing a lot of work. Maybe over the phone, were you?
Yeah, no, I'm pretty busy. Yeah, proposals.
Oh, yeah. Pitching.
Yeah, looking for work, as usual, mate.
Yeah. Do you want to put out an appeal?
No.
Just joking. No. I see that where you've been, though, the temperatures have been great.
Yeah. No, the temperatures have been nice. I was down in Wellington recently, and the temperatures were surprisingly less great, but still really? Very nice.
Oh, well, it's been beautiful in Auckland, where I am right now. In fact, on the way over to do the podcast, Martin, I looked up in the sky, heard this very, almost inaudible whisper. I looked up, and there was a LATAM 787-9 just cruising through the sky, probably on the base leg for an approach or something. It looks so serene. Beautiful scene. Big bird.
Yeah, beautiful. Drifting in nice and slow. They're so controllable at very low speeds, these modern planes. However, I don't know how the passengers feel after crammed into a 787 or a long flight across the South Pacific.
And over the pole.
Nine abreast in the 787 ain't great.
Okay, but from the ground, it looked fantastic. Before we get underway, Martin, got to tell everybody that the interview at the end of this podcast is with Steve Thomas, the grandson of Captain Dave Thomas. Captain Dave Thomas was one of the first 8 New Zealand 737 captains to be trained to fly the new 737 jets that were delivered to NAC, the local airline before Air New Zealand, before the merger with the International Air New Zealand. And they went off to Seattle, trained to fly the 737, flew them home, and then, in Dave's case anyway, he flew them for 10 years, between 68 and when NAC finished in 1978. So Steve will take us through a bit of history to do with his grandfather and his involvement in NAC. And again, it just underpins the work we're doing with Bring Our Birds Home, why we are motivated to save these aircraft. In this case, as it relates to Dave, ZKNAD, the second NAC 73 delivered, the aircraft that flew the first domestic commercial jet service, and the aircraft that Dave trained on before they brought it over to New Zealand around Seattle and Moses Lake back in 1968. So I look forward to talking with Steve at the end of the podcast. We have to start on Air New Zealand. Last podcast, we didn't have a go at them. We don't have a go at anyone, really. That's not our thing. But we were looking at why they were experiencing, I think it was $100 million below what they'd indicated for their profit. And that was a considerable lowering of what they led the market to expect. Now they're slashing airfares. I had a look after they announced this thing about a week ago, and already the fares mid-March on through were down $39.49 on many of the seats. That probably didn't last too long. There's been sort of differing opinions about it. Christopher Luxon says it's the biggest overhaul of their fare structure in 10 years, so that sounds big. But I hear the House of Travel saying, well, when it comes down to it, it's still only a very small percentage of seats, and if you're not in quick, you're going to miss out. And, we're going to have to wait and see if it really means something. So what do you make of this?
Well, I've recently bought a regional ticket to Air New Zealand, and it wasn't $39, but it was significantly cheaper than what I was expecting to pay, and that was a few days after the announcement. What do I make of it? Air New Zealand are obviously not going to put all their cards on the table straight up, but I think this is an admission that they do have. There's a number of current issues that are facing them. They're getting hammered by guys like Shane Jones. Fair enough, because he says you're not helping the regions. You've also got a very, very angry Virgin Australia that feel a bit jilted after the Trans-Tasman arrangement was ditched, and they've got apparently 5 ATRs sitting down in Nelson Airport in storage, where a couple of licks of paint and a Tiger logo on there, and they could start competing within the next couple of months. Now, Tiger bill themselves as the cheapest airline in Australasia.
Right. Yeah, I've seen the picture of them sitting there at Nelson.
Yeah, that could be pretty scary for Air New Zealand, because even with reduced prices and if they manage to do their yield management properly, they're still going to make a lot of money on the regions if they're the only people really playing in the regions. Jetstar, and now that Qantas and Air New Zealand are working closely together, Jetstar will continue to operate to keep them honest, but Jetstar have never really made the big commitment to the regions that would really frighten Air New Zealand. And as I said, now that Air New Zealand and Qantas are getting a bit cozier, that will probably never happen. So I think it's a preemptive price reduction to keep the competition away, because the Virgin entering or via Tiger could be a very big problem. It also keeps the government happy. Most importantly, it restores a whole heap of goodwill, and this is goodwill that they have been losing slowly because they're a rip-off. And internationally, the same thing's going to happen, because at the end of the day, I like to fly Air New Zealand. I do. If I can, I'll fly Air New Zealand. But when I can save $600, $900 on a flight to Europe with another airline, I'm flying another airline. Because there's no airline that's $600 better.
What it tells me is that it's more than just airfares. And I think this is why that perhaps they've been quite dramatic in what they've done. It's a combination of being too expensive, but brand loyalty can offset that. But when you mix in an ebbing of brand loyalty, that is a bad situation, because even discounting may not help as much, because then you come up against the cynicism that's built up towards the brand. And I think that's what might have happened here, and that's a bigger problem. That's a bigger problem to address.
It is a big problem, because once you lose customers and they start trialing the competition, and you get out of a long aluminium tube and you think, well, actually, I couldn't actually, apart from the colors in the cabin, you can't tell the difference.
Exactly.
But it's cheaper. I mean, I did a flight recently with Virgin. I was like, oh, well, I'll take Virgin. It was significantly cheaper. And I didn't have to choose between 6 different ticket types. I just bought the cheapest ticket. I got luggage and I got a meal, right? Exactly as their advertisement now says. Get luggage and a meal, right? Okay. Was it as nice as Air New Zealand? It was exactly the same as Air New Zealand.
Yeah.
The only difference was it was a purple decor on the plane. The staff had perhaps a slightly unusual accent, and the seat back didn't have a screen in it, but I could watch it on my phone, which was actually probably better, because my phone's got a better resolution than some of those screens in the back of the seat. And I actually said to the person I was sitting to, because we'd had a bit of a talk about during the flight, I said, can you tell the difference between this and any other airline? And he said, nah.
Yeah.
And he also said to me, he says, I fly this, it was an internal Australian flight. He says, I fly this one a lot. I buy the ticket on price. That's the only thing I look for. I'm like, yeah, well, I'm beginning to agree with you, mate.
A lot's been made, though, of that Kiwi culture that is Air New Zealand and how unique it is and all of that. And now it's okay for the flag carrier to leverage off all of us, because that's what you're doing when you're using that as your major point of difference. If you consider yourself the national flag carrier, and they are by sort of default and legacy. But if you're behaving in ways that only look like serving you and not so much the customers, look at the reaction to those safety videos. Not good. Not good. On the whole, bad.
Well, it got a bit tired.
And people go, it's a cringe factor now, being in the cabin listening to these things. Like, you almost feel like you have to apologize to the person next to you, for having been put through it. They think they're doing a wonderful, witty, funny thing. But they're not. You see, they're not.
But, that's okay, and that's a learning experience. Yeah,
they've been doing it for years. They should have learned by now.
Yeah, they've been doing it for too long. Exactly. It's not fresh anymore. And it was cool when it was fresh. It was, oh, yeah, that's all magic and blah, blah, blah. No, it's just same old. It's boring. Oh, we good. It's become more of a YouTube hit thing than an actual, it's got tired. But, at the end of the day, people aren't stupid. You're sitting in a long aluminium tube. It makes no difference. Right. I mean, obviously, there's some airlines, maybe dodgy, but if you're flying across the Tasman, they're all pretty good.
The only difference
more important is, there's a huge difference in price. But more important is, they're all pretty good, but none of them is actually outstanding. All right.
Yeah. Well,
for me anyway.
I could be getting it wrong. I don't know, but it seems to me that it's more just now than a pricing issue. It's a brand issue, and it's the feel of the brand, and I think Kiwis have kind of disconnected from the way it used to be.
Well, that was the point I was trying to make. One leads to another. unless your brand is absolutely outstanding and it's worth the extra $50, $100, $200, $300, you've just wasted your time, because it's not.
Exactly.
It's not. And it works for a while, but after a while, the moment people think, you know what, there's an offer here for $200 less, I'm going to take it. I mean, it's happening to me. I'm flying back to Oz the next couple of days. I've saved nearly $400.
Wow.
By not flying with Air New Zealand.
Yeah, well,
and Air New Zealand, I have to say, had some really good flights on the days that I didn't want to fly. But on the day I wanted to fly, which was a Sunday, I've saved a bundle.
Yeah. Here's the thing. You don't know if you pay. This not transparent. You don't know if you're paying too much because there's not enough seats. You know, there's no.
The plane might be empty.
And that's why when I say it's all about them, not about the customer. Yeah, but the customer's got to feel that it's about them as well. You're not just a cash cow or an ATM for these guys, you know?
Yeah, well, of course you are, and they try and cover it up with branding and making you feel special.
Well,
but
people are grumpy now.
You literally are an ATM.
Yeah. Well, you're an ATM to anything that you. But you know what that implies. You know, you get as much out of the ATM as you possibly can. You know, before the decline thing happens.
Exactly.
Anyway, so watch that space. But I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if we see some personnel. We'll see what happens. Anyway, I won't try and second guess, but
I think prices are going to stay pretty special now. They've just offered and unfortunately for me, I can't fly on those dates, but they've just offered some really tight pricing. The sale ended, I think, midnight last night, but they were offering. Oh, I think you could have got a return from Auckland or Wellington, a return to East Coast Australia for under $400.
Wow.
Which is unheard of.
Well, I do remember Christopher Luxon, or the news that came before the announcement of the biggest overhaul of the pricing structure in 10 years. They were talking about having a slump in forward bookings.
Yeah.
And this is obviously in their thinking as well. They need to, to pump prime that. But again, you've got to ask, why is there a slump in forward bookings?
Yeah, I mean, I did this thing for a friend the other day. They wanted to fly to the States. They wanted to fly to the East Coast America, and they'd gone and they'd looked on the Air New Zealand website, and they had a flight. It was Auckland, Houston, I think it was Atlanta, with United, and it was expensive. And I thought, geez, that is quite expensive. And we discussed various options with alternate airlines, and I said, well, let me have a look for you, and I'll just have a look what price I can get for you. And I saved them nearly $800, and they're still flying Air New Zealand to the west coast of America, and then they're picking up United in San Francisco and flying on to their destination. The flight's 3 hours longer, right? Okay, which is a pain. It is a pain. It's 3 hours longer, but it's $800.
Well, that's good rate for 3 hours.
And they fly, but it's ticketed with United, the whole flight.
Right.
So, is that a disadvantage? This customer is not a gold customer or a silver or anything. They just want to go and see their kids over who are studying over in the States. They saved $800. It's taking 3 hours longer, mate.
Well, think about what you can do with the kids with $800, spending money more than you had.
Yeah,
I mean that's what that
was
means.
very interesting. That was very interesting to me, and that was directly off the United website.
Wow. Here's another thing. If they're bringing in like A321 Neos to fly domestic, which is what they're going to be doing, I think 8 are coming, in the next 2 or 3 years.
320s, right?
Let's say that they are at least 10, 12% on actual cash in and out basis of the current. Are we going to see a discount? I mean, is it going to lower their prices, or are they just going to maintain the margins and sort of like run off to the bank laughing? Oh, now we're really screwing them,
Well, I think what that gives them is it gives them the option to provide that discount if the market needs it, and if things continue to not go as well as they have been, you'll definitely start seeing a discount due to that aircraft.
You should be seeing a cheaper flights internationally, because the 777-300 is vastly cheaper than the 747-400 to operate, yet the fares are about the same or more expensive than they were. Yeah,
it's got nothing to do with the real price. It's got to do with the pain threshold, doesn't it?
And I think people have wised up to that.
The pain threshold's been reached, which is why you can get a flight which is $800 cheaper with United, which is stunning, actually stunning.
Well, people are more than ever sensitive on price. They know what a good deal is, and it's easy to access them now, like you've just explained there. Though understanding that basically you're buying exactly the same as you'd get by buying through another website, but it's 800 cheaper. It's on the same equipment, the same hardware. It's crazy.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
It is. I was very interested. I was very surprised to see that. Very surprised, considering it was an Air New Zealand flight to San Fran.
Yeah, I see. Air
Now, there were, if you'd flown a bit later, you'd have gone on the United 787. But this person said, "Oh, if I
big
can fly
deal." Again, on the inside, no change, about the same.
Fundamentally, no change. No.
So, does anyone really care? I don't think as much now.
No, well, it's become like most things; they've become commoditized, haven't they?
Yeah.
But anyway, yeah, interesting.
And I see that Air New Zealand has teamed up, I guess, through Star Alliance or something, with Air Canada, who will be operating flights direct to New Zealand, Vancouver, Auckland, Vancouver, starting service from this December, it says here. Canadian national carrier will have 4 flights a week from December 12 until March 2020. And it will go head-to-head with Star Alliance partner Air New Zealand. Air Canada Vice President John McLeod said the two airlines will work closely together. Well, how do you do that? I suppose you share resources and you code share, but, I mean, they're the competition essentially.
Yeah. The competition essentially, and what's happened is that Air New Zealand pricing has exposed a weakness, and therefore they'll come in and do it. Yeah, who wouldn't?
The Minister of Tourism, Kelvin Davis, I'm reading from a Stuff article here just from a few days ago, says the link will deepen the connections between our countries. 71,000 Canadians visited New Zealand last year, staying on average 19 days. Air Canada flies to over 200 destinations, including, of course, Brisbane, Melbourne, Sydney. And, I mean, they've made a huge comeback, Air Canada. I think they were nearly broke about 10 or 12 years ago or 15 years ago. They were bankrupt.
Yeah, well, you had Air Canada and Canadian Airlines, didn't you? And it all got quite messy.
Yeah. So anyway, that's Air New Zealand, and we'll watch that space and see what happens. What do you got? What's next?
Well, I read that Airbus is apparently taking pre-orders on the so-called A321XLR, which sounds interesting. So they're already in deep discussions with airlines. So that's another 4 or 5 tons on top of the current 97-ton max weight of the A321 long range. So that adds that puts it at this is unbelievable, actually. So you got an A321 now with a range of up to 5,000 miles.
My golly! Thank you.
So
that's the 757 now officially replaced.
Pretty much, yeah. You're looking at easy Central Europe to East Coast USA.
Incredible. And
they're looking at 200 to 300 orders before committing, but the word out seems to be that they're pretty close to getting at least 300 orders. They're also offering it. One of the reasons they're offering it is but this is probably not gone against them, but they put it to market to see whether the customers are going to insist on a new wing, which we've talked about quite a lot to give it a lot more capability. But it seems, from what I'm hearing, that the customers are relatively happy with the wing as it is and just adding a few tons and giving it the extra range. However, that's not to say that if Airbus might see a lot more potential by re-winging it, and that still might go ahead. But really interesting. It's taken that A321 and really just hit it out of the park. Now you can imagine if they then do decide to put a new wing on it, and slight capacity bump up to sort of 250, 260. First of all, that just smashes the Boeing MOM, right, middle of the market machine.
Yeah.
And they reckon they could still have it in the air within 24 months.
Crikey.
Even with a new wing, because apparently they've done all the engineering.
Wow. Well, this is like everything that we have said. I mean, not to try and make us, Einsteins of the aviation world, and I guess it's been so obvious, but everything, evolution of the A321 towards the A322, as we've put it, with that wing adjustment and those incremental, or that ability to stretch even more and add that weight. And of course, then beyond that, that's the new wing. So they have blocked off their corner so well.
Oh, they've done it really well. Yeah. So you imagine. So they're looking 4 or 5 tons on the current A321LR, but hang on, we put a new wing on, we can add 8 to 9 tons. So now you're looking at 250, 260 people, 5,000 miles and 2 classes. Yeah, you've smashed the 757, and you've basically made Boeing's business case very, very difficult, because if they thought they could sell 3,000 planes, now they can sell maximum sort of maybe 1,500, because half the market's just disappeared. With a plane which will be available in 2 years.
They have to make something that is better than the next plane that Airbus can make after this. They have to make that now. Man, that's a tall order. That is a huge tall order.
I reckon Boeing can do it, but they have to get rid of keeping short-term shareholders happy.
Yeah, but as time goes by, the more difficult it is to do, because you think of how many years the lead-in is for that.
And they've made a few. Boeing, I don't know whether this is short-termism or conservativeness. I don't know, but you're hearing a lot of stories about the expansion possibilities on the 787, and a lot of commentators out there saying there's just not much more they can add to the 787. They can't increase the weight that much. They can't. So they can increase the gross weight of the 787-900 a little bit, but not really much that makes a huge difference. And the 787-1000, the long one, the 10, or 787-10, sorry, as they call it, very little they can do with that, because apparently the undercarriage is maxed out. And to develop new undercarriage, you're like, oh, really? That seems a bit short-sighted.
That's happened before.
Yeah.
They did that with the 737.
Yeah, exactly. And isn't the whole market these days with planes about future-proofing the fundamental systems so you can get them going for another 20 years? I mean, look at the A330. That's ridiculous how far that plane's developed. Look at the A350. Now they're talking, now that the A380 is being apparently cancelled, that they can make an A350 1100 and 1200, which would take it up beyond the 777-9X.
Wow.
Wow, really?
Surely it says a lot as far as Boeing is concerned that they're all the other models, apart from the 787, they're not using the same production process. They've gone through that whole experience and they're not using it.
Yeah, well, that's interesting for a whole lot of reasons. I remember you may remember it. Remember the old Beechcraft Starliner?
Yes. What a stunning aircraft. Stunning looking. Bird Rutan.
And that was all built out of carbon fiber as well. And I remember people at the time saying that was meant to be built out of carbon fiber because it was going to be stronger than lighter than aluminium. And it may have been stronger, but it was like 25% heavier.
Right.
And people were saying the same thing applies. The same thing will apply to the 787. They said in order to get the lightness down, it gets very, very expensive.
Yeah.
And that's why Boeing, they are actively considering, apparently, the Airbus method for the middle of the market, which is carbon fiber, basically a traditional airframe with carbon fiber panels stuck to it.
And I think that already operates on the A350, doesn't it? That production method?
That's exactly what they've done, And they reckon if they went with the A322, they wouldn't even have to do the whole fuselage, but they could reduce significant weight by paneling parts of the fuselage using carbon fiber panels.
Which they know how to do. So,
yeah,
it's a fascinating situation. I think that middle of the market plane is... you can see that there's been a bit of an increase in the tempo of that being mentioned in media. So obviously the battle's on, right? Must be.
Battle's on, yeah. But, Boeing, it'll be, whatever they do will be great. But, they're being slowly eroded. They're getting kind of boxed in. Yeah. They've left it too long, maybe. It's like that Sonic Cruiser thing.
That's my point.
It looked awesome. Yeah. Yeah.
Maybe they'll go back to the Sonic Cruiser.
It's also interesting. Again, this is another Airbus thing, and I know we talk a lot about Airbus, but we should just mention that British Airways have ordered 42 737-9Xs, so it's good for Boeing on that.
Yeah.
But I just read that. Remember the old A300? FedEx operates a lot of them.
Yeah.
And they've got 52 of them, right?
Wow.
And they're replacing the cockpit with Epic Primus big screen glass cockpit. They're replacing all the complete cockpits. So they're going to be it won't be like an A350 or a 787, but it'll be possibly even more modern.
Wow.
It'll look similar to, the PC-12. You ever look in the cockpit of the Pilatus PC-12?
I think so, yeah. Sort of like that.
The new one with the big 15-inch screens and everything. That's what the old A300, the FedEx are all going to get.
Those are 600.
So they're obviously going to keep...
They were the last ones. Back in mid-2000s, right? The last ones off the line, I think.
Yeah. So they're obviously going to keep them for a while. So each screen, I looked at it. So there's going to be 2 screens in front of each flight crew member, and each of those screens is more than double the area of the current 2 screens.
Wow!
So they're going to have 4.5, 5 times as much screen real estate.
Well, to keep that fleet active means they're very useful. Otherwise, they'd be losing them, wouldn't they?
Yeah, I think they love them.
They got huge capacity, those A300s.
Yeah, but light stuff. So a lot of volumes for transporting chips.
Speaking of cargo airliners, what about that Atlas 763 crash at Houston? It just nosedived into the ground. Nothing heard about. The aircraft it was in good shape. Flying for, what is it, the Prime Air airline, the Amazon delivery airline. It was located in Trinity Bay in Texas.
Is that load shifting?
Could be. But if you look at the profiles that have been put up, everything's fine until about the last little bit, and then a ridiculous descent rate, and boom.
Yeah, then it wasn't fine.
No, so that's got, I think, people. It was on a standard arrival route from the southeast. The crew checked in with Houston approach, 18,000 feet, 76 nautical miles southeast of Houston Intercontinental Airport, 12:30 local time in the afternoon. ATC advised there was light to heavy rain ahead, offered vectors around the weather. The aircraft was declared to descend to 3,000 feet. Just a few minutes later, radio and radar contact was lost when the aircraft was at 240 knots. At about 6,000 feet. And it showed that the aircraft had descended and impacted after a deep descent in a steep nose-down attitude and, into what looks like a sort of very shallow inlet area.
Yeah. Yeah. 5 feet, they reckon. 3 feet of water and 5 feet of mud.
Right.
And the people are saying very difficult to recover anything out of that.
What could do that? On a 767's had a great safety record. Only 2 767s have been lost through mechanical problems in the entire history of the aircraft being operated since 1982.
Yeah.
Wow.
Interesting, eh? Wow, yeah.
Yeah, anyway, okay, so...
cool, guys. Yeah.
A few other incidents looking at the Aviation Herald site here. That has happened. A 76 of Air Canada went off the runway at Halifax, vacating the runway. A runway excursion upon vacating the runway. In other words, they're off into the grass.
Yeah.
And a few other cracked windshields, pilot incapacitated, a few flat bits dropping off.
When you look at the Aviation Herald, which, by the way, guys, is avherald.com, it's actually amazing how many incidents there are.
Oh, I mean, there's totally,
daily incidents, daily.
Well, today, Tuesday, the 5th of March, 9 incidents from an A380 rejected takeoff at Miami due to brakes, all the way to Qantas 73 Adelaide cabin pressure problems, and a whole lot in between in one day.
Yeah. It's really interesting.
Yeah. But that's an unusual. That's an unusual occurrence for that 767. Anyway, hey, back to Napier, I see, and we're skipping all over the place, but that's what we like to do. You've now got a local airline, Air Napier. Do you know about Air Napier?
I've heard about Air Napier, yeah. I don't know anything about it, but I have heard about it, yeah.
Well, you haven't heard about it because they've been doing what's called a soft launch, where you don't hear about it. Anyway, they're going to be running passenger flights between Gisborne and Napier, and they're going to be flying 6 flights a week between the two cities. I don't know how little airlines in New Zealand end up doing. Probably, I don't know how well they'll do. But there you go. People are still willing to give it a go. Yeah,
it's They do charter flights and scenic flights as well. So maybe they're just going to see how they go. They're operating. It's not a. I don't know what it is. It's not a big plane. It's
right.
I think it's.
Well, Piper
not a
Navajo.
Baron. Yeah, no. Well, it's a a twin engine. Sorry, not a four engine. It's a twin. I think it's like a Baron or something.
Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. I remember back in the day in the 80s, Air Central used to be based at Napier. They started off with a couple of those, 8-seater Cessna 40 somethings. I can't remember the exact model. I flew on one of them once, single pilot IFR sort of deal. But then they got those Mitsubishis, those high-speed turboprops.
Oh yeah, they're very cool. Those things.
And they were based there for a long time at Napier. And I think also there was an airline that operated out of Napier that had the Dornier high-wing planes, the ones you see the Indians flying around in.
Oh really?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So it looks like the one they're going that Air Napier is going to be using. It's a Seneca.
Oh right, Piper Seneca.
Piper Seneca.
Yeah. Hey, aren't you, like me, hopefully, enjoying seeing these retro liveries that BA is bringing out for their 100th anniversary? Aren't they amazing? Isn't that BA livery really cool?
Very cool. Very cool. Yeah.
Black, white, red, and grey. Wow.
In fact, you wonder why they don't go back.
Well,
to it.
It's so cool.
Better.
So cool. Yeah. And that BOAC, like I said in the last podcast, I was hoping for polished metal down below, but they haven't done that predictably.
Nah.
So that means it was driven by the marketing department. But,
of course it was.
All said and done, that looks pretty cool as well, I got to say. And I guess they've got, the British Airways livery of the 80s with the big flag on the tail yet to come?
Landor livery.
Well, no, the one before that. They had after they merged BEA and BOAC and became British Airways, they had the big Union Jack tail, which occupied the whole tail, blue underneath with British Airways and the Speedbird on there, and that was that was on for ages. Wow. Then the Landor one came with the to serve to fly. Is that the one?
Landor had the crest on the tail. It didn't have the flag. It had like a simplified flag. Yeah.
That should look pretty good, but I think that BEA, that is the best I've seen. I just love the combination of colours, black, red, white, and grey. It's fantastic.
Yeah. It does look awesome, actually, yeah.
Yeah, very elegant. And, of course, look at all the publicity it's getting them. And you have to ask yourself, and I've asked this, bring it back home again, and many of the people we've talked to and who are enthusiastic about aviation in this country, why doesn't Air New Zealand do a few retro liveries? Do you think if you want to connect with the public and make them feel good and get your mojo back, how about thinking about something like that? People really love that sort of stuff.
I've just been we did absolutely, and Air New Zealand had some cracking liveries. I've just been looking at the British Airways liveries from 1974 to 2015 on the interwebs, and I didn't realise that remember the blue tail with a Speedbird on it?
Yep.
Okay, that was called British Airways Negus, Negus.
That's the name of that livery.
British Airways Negus, and that was from 74 to 81. Then from 1980 to 1984, they had British Negus, which had it was a white top with a blue bottom half of the airframe, British Airways written in the front of the plane, and a sort of red tail tip with a highly stylized quarter of a Union Jack.
Yeah, that's the one I was talking about. Yeah.
Then it went silver Negus, which was marginally different. It had British instead of British Airways written on it, and that only lasted for a year. Then you had Landor came in.
Yep.
Right? And then you had the one that was for some reason, really unpopular, but I always thought was pretty cool. It was called Utopia, World Tails.
Oh, I thought that was very cool. Very cool.
Yeah, but apparently it was very unpopular.
Well, I tell you why, because it wasn't patriotic. People lost the connection with, and
fair enough.
It's as basic as that, I think, but very artistically fantastic.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah. Then they went with the Union flag, Chatham Royal. I love the names they give their paint frames. And now it's 2014 to present. It's called Brilliant White to Fly to Serve.
To fly to serve.
Oh, they're out of their mind.
Yeah, well,
anyway.
you've got to keep the Britishness, because that's the brand. It's like keeping the Kiwi-ness of something. But you give it those names and it sounds, I love that, to fly, to serve. Empire, isn't it? It's got an empire feel to it.
I think British Airways is very, very good, because what they do is they make the premium class people feel better by treating the economy class just like they're a bunch of peasants. Right? In the back, and shut up with you.
It's the class system at work, mate. They can't.
It is. It really is.
They can't leave it alone.
Yeah, your economy, shut up and get down the end.
Yeah. We don't want to hear anything from you until we're there, and we'll throw you a few scraps of food along the way, but shut up.
Yeah. Leave us alone.
And don't smoke.
Yeah, it's quite funny. Yeah, anyway,
speaking of the Poms, Farnborough International Airshow reported today will no longer host a public weekend after negative and vitriolic feedback for displays. It's been announced. Organisers said the Shoreham air crash had expedited the decision. Was that the Hawker Hunter that crashed? Must have been.
Yeah, well, our mate piled it in, yeah.
Which comes amid a dwindling number of spectators. Dwindling? Air shows are, okay, I always thought that they were very popular. Every one that I've ever been to has been very popular. So they're focusing on a 5-day trade show now.
That's a pity.
Yeah, they say they appreciate the affection plane lovers had for the public weekend, but it received very negative and vitriolic feedback from 2018. Look, I mean, are people that scared these days that if something goes wrong, and in aviation things can go wrong. When it goes wrong, it's dramatic. That was a horrible thing. It doesn't happen every time. It's a very rare thing. But because of that, now all the fun goes. Great.
Yeah.
Because people are all shocked and crazy emotional. Now, that seems to be happening a lot these days, Martin. Things are shut down if people are offended.
Thing is, what we don't know is maybe it's less to do with the public refusing to attend or being extremely vitriolic. Maybe it's more to do with the insurance company saying, yeah, you're happy to have a pilot. We'll give you a weekend for the public, but it's going to cost you $5 million a day in insurance.
Yeah.
I'm a cynic and a skeptic, so perhaps I'm wrong.
Well, okay, then we'll come out and say it's because we're not prepared to pay the insurance. People could understand that, actually. But what it does here, it's like, it was a terrible thing, and that means that we could never have a public display at an air show again. Crazy.
Yeah, no, it is crazy.
And that whole tradition of that air show is public displays. If you look at all the old footage.
Absolutely, but this does prove the point that the main and obviously the most successful reason behind the
trade show
shows is that they obviously sell a lot of weapons. So.
Weapons. Well, okay. Maybe it's actually too controversial to show military hardware now.
Yeah. I feel offended. I feel very offended by it.
Well, there's going to be nothing happening anywhere if that carries on,
if England stops selling weapons, half the economy would shut down. So you better get over it. It's what's paying for the welfare state.
Yeah. Oh, really? That's interesting. I want to get on to MH370, Martin, because we talk about MH370 a lot, and there's been no shortage in the time between the last podcast and now of more MH370 stories. Some of them are just, I got to say, absolutely crackers. People are losing their marbles, and the media companies are proving that clickbait is all that matters. The clothes are off the emperor. We can see that now, and they're prepared to lower their journalistic standards to a ridiculous level. It's embarrassing. But anyway, there are also some better theories being talked about that are being reported. The latest one I see in the Express in the UK is talking about an oxygen bottle explosion now. And I think we were talking about that 2 days after it happened, because we were doing the podcast back then, because of things that had happened before that point towards that being a possible fault. And a more likely scenario than the captain had some film star or actor or singer out there in the middle of the Indian Ocean that he was going to parachute to. I mean, that guy was on some sort of drugs who came up with that. I just don't understand that. But
I'm a bit upset you said that, Paul, because that's the theory I reckon is the best one. He parachuted to a raft.
It just shows you that, and I can understand that there are nutters, I'll use that word around, nutters, who come up with wild theories and that they give themselves a label that looks credible when it's quoted in a newspaper article, a so-and-so expert or whatever. And, I mean, there's no reason why a Qantas captain can't actually be kind of crazy. I mean, it doesn't mean that you're default sane if you're an airline captain, right, or a retired one. So, you know, the credibility when you're coming up with such a wild theory, and that was the one about jumping out of the plane and seeing the lover. I mean, that tells me that you're in a fantasy world, or you are cynically taking advantage of the media's willingness to print anything on this, to take the clicks and to take the advertising and throw under the bus everybody who was on that plane. How dare they?
Yep.
Man, it makes me mad.
Yeah, no, you're right. But yeah, that's what they're doing. Yeah, it's clickbait. Yeah.
And people are right, and it just proves it. And people will rise to the clickbait opportunity. So it's a self-fulfilling shit cycle, actually. That's what it is. Excuse the language.
And have you noticed how, like every 2-3 weeks a new MH3, it's just like, oh, well, there'll be an algorithm somewhere that's calculated that every time they bring out an MH370 story that they get 5 million clicks across the world. So whenever they got a bit of quiet time, or not even a pretty bit of quiet time, because it takes up no space to run a story like that, because they'll get the same 5 million people clicking on it. So They just do it. It's terrible.
Yeah.
That's the way things are.
Well, I'm reported today in some publication called The Stock Standard, because I've done a search for today, just today's news, March 6th we are, but this is reported in the Northern Hemisphere, so March 5th. MH370 shock. Malaysia more than willing to reopen search for Malaysian Airlines plane. They're considering reopening the search to find the aircraft carrying 239 people. And there's interest now on a piece of wing debris found in Pemba Island, Tanzania. I don't know when that was, but that's what they're talking about here. And they're talking about that the search should be more closer to that area now. So, I mean, it's like a wild goose chase all over that part of the world, isn't it?
Yeah. I don't know what to say. You know, it's going to be it's going to be shockingly mundane. The real reason, they're going to find it eventually. Something will come up. They probably won't get the data recorder at this point because it might be corrupted too long underwater. But they'll see it, and I reckon it's going to be the oxygen thing, like we said from the beginning.
Yeah,
it just seems to be. You know what they say, if it's the most likely thing, it's going to be it.
Well, there's two scenarios on the oxygen thing, and that is that something like happened on the ground at Cairo happened, and oxygen was pure oxygen was in the cockpit. Someone lit a cigarette. I think that's probably what happened. The co-pilot, he was a smoker. They smoke on Asian planes. There's no big deal about that. And it happened at the top of the climb when everything goes relaxed. Remember that last words, good night, from MH370? That's when the pressure comes off. But the other thing is, remember, I think you discovered it, that this is a few years ago, we talked about this, a BA 777-200 climbing out of Heathrow had an oxygen blockage in the cockpit, and the door was shut, and the door sealed so tight that the cockpit started draining of oxygen. They all got lightheaded, and they had to open the door. Now, that could have happened at altitude when everyone's sleepy up there. Good night from MH370. Let's kick back because we've got 5 hours before we have to, in the middle of the night, before we have to do anything. And, you know, quite easily that could have happened too. They'd go off to sleep. No one can open the door. It's an armored door, you know. Those are, I think, the two most likely scenarios. Though there's a lot of talk from the conspiracy theorists that the autopilot is controllable, but I don't know about that.
Yeah. Again, you know, it takes too much of a leap of faith. It's likely to be something simple, and those planes do have known occasional oxygen issues. I suspect it's that.
Yeah.
But until we know, we won't know, and everything else is speculation. And the newspapers or the media companies rely on the fact that we love a bit of speculation, so they'll run some BS story every 3 or 4 weeks, and 5 million people will click on it, or however many the algorithm determines is the audience.
Algorithm. That is so depressing to hear you say that.
Yeah.
And of course, fancy demonizing the poor captain. I mean, the way he's been talked about, he's like the devil incarnate. He's like, you know, the darkest person on the face of the earth. who would do something this. I mean, it's a horrible destruction of his character.
It is. It's a horrible, but it's obviously an amazing parachutist because he can get out of a wide body, jump out, miss the wings,
open the door. He can actually open the door.
There's a lot of wing just behind the front door on a
and there's a lot
777.
There's a lot of horizontal stabilizer at the back end too that you'll end up on the leading edge of too.
So he had to dodge 70, 80 feet of wing. Then he had to dodge 30, 40 feet of horizontal stabilizer.
And how fast are you going?
No, he's pretty good. Good.
How fast are you going? You must have seen or read the story about the guy, I forget his name, who jumped out of the Northwest 7.2 over, was it Montana somewhere with a cache?
DB Cooper.
He's been reading that. But anyway, I don't know if anyone in the news business is listening to this podcast, but come on. Get your act together. This is becoming farcical. No one minds if there's a theory that comes up that has supporting evidence that's reasonable, but this craziness is just...
Well, there's no evidence on this, so they should just,
shut up.
Yeah.
Anyway,
shut up.
That was a bit of a rant, but it's been building up. Yeah. It's been building up.
You're obviously not happy.
We've got to...
I want to talk about Qantas next.
Okay, what's up with Qantas?
Qantas are looking very hard at Sydney Heathrow and Melbourne Heathrow, and they've invited Boeing and Airbus to provide more info on their ultra-long-range aircraft. Very interesting. Sydney Heathrow is 9,188 nautical miles or 17,016 kilometers. Now, it's interesting to me to realize, because the Great Circle route always just blows my mind, head explosion.
Yeah.
That Melbourne Heathrow is only like 120 k's less or 113 k's less. So that's 9,127 nautical miles or 16,903 kilometers, which is okay. That's a long way, right? We're all agreed that's a long way.
It is a long way.
Sydney, New York, 8,646 miles or 16,012. Now, the current longest flight is Singapore-Newark, and they're flying that with an A350-900 ultra-long range, and that's 15,343 kilometers.
Not far.
They need to add another 1,000, or in the case of Sydney Heathrow, Melbourne, they need to add nearly 2,000 kilometers to that. Let's call it for safety. Now, Qantas reckon they want to be doing this within the next 3 years, which is interesting. Because that's going to rule out 300 passenger planes because you're going to have load restrictions and everything. So they're looking at a premium heavy like the Singapore Airlines flight to Newark, which is they only seat 67 in business and 94 in premium economy. So it's 161 passengers on an A350-900. That's a lot of empty space, but it's obviously paying because that flight is apparently it's making money.
Right.
The other really long flight operated by Qantas is they're using a 787-900. That's 14,500 kilometers. And that's actually got quite a few seats, but it's load limited. So it's a 236-seat 787, but they're only running 212 passengers and little or no cargo. Little or no cargo with 212 passengers. So that is very interesting that quite quickly this new generation of aircraft have stepped up to offer what was unimaginable 10 years ago, right?
That's right. Only that long ago, yeah.
Yeah. It's that will, and apparently that flight from Perth to London, it's very popular, and it's only about $200 more expensive than the regular flight because, of course, they're not paying the landing fees and everything going down in Singapore or Dubai.
Yeah.
So, but what makes this even more interesting to me is that everyone's panning the A380. And yet no one disputes the fact that an A380 with 350, 400 people on it could also fly Sydney to Europe. But that never gets mentioned.
Why?
I don't know. It's also, the A380 is not economical. Yeah, but you're running it at 200 or 300 people less than it could comfortably carry.
I just don't get it. I've never got it.
I don't get it either.
I've never got it.
It's like the same people that hammer Tesla. You're like, but people are buying them and they really like them, so maybe you're wrong.
Well,
I don't know.
Anyway. I don't know either. Interesting to hear that. Speaking of Tesla and Elon Musk, let's make that segue. The Dragon capsule got to the space station. Oh, my God. So it's all on again now, isn't it?
See, I've got an app on my phone that tells me I've got it set that it tells me within an hour of every SpaceX launch, and I watch them. I just watch them because that sight of the boosters coming back to land.
Oh yeah, incredible!
Blows my mind.
You see the reactions of the crowd. Some of them are nearly in tears. You can hear them like, "Oh my God!" You know.
Did you watch the Falcon Heavy takeoff when those two boosters came back and landed next to each other?
That was incredible.
That was it's just unbelievable.
That was awesome. I see. Elon Musk said he thought it was worth, what did he say, the last 17 years of stress and struggle, or something is how he put it.
Yeah, no, that is just mind blowing, and it's becoming so routine, and so that the not this recent launch, the one that went up about 2 weeks prior, where they launched the Israeli moon probe and the Indonesian internet satellite, it came down and it came down a bit hard and crumpled one of the it's got like a crash protection aluminium honeycomb thing that's designed to absorb the load. So the thing hit the barge out in the middle of nowhere. 500 k's away. So it takes off, goes up to an altitude of 115 kilometers, gets up to a speed of God knows what, and then lands 10 minutes later 500 kilometers away.
Incredible.
On an area about the size of a tennis court, right?
Yeah.
In a pitching anyway. So that booster made it down, and it came down quite hard. So it crumpled one of the shock absorption pads, whatever you call it. And that's going to go up for a fourth time because they're going to use that to test the Dragon escape mechanism, the capsule ejection system. So then, they're going to send it up to 20, 30 Ks up in the sky and blast the capsule. And they reckon it might still land, in which case they'd use it for a fifth time. But they think it might not land. They might just, it might ditch. But they're not entirely sure. And you're like, my God, it's become that routine that you just think, whatever.
Well, it has become that routine.
It really has. It really has become. Everyone else is just going, yes, son of a biscuit. Jeez.
Well, here's the thing now.
It just makes everyone else look stupid, doesn't it?
SpaceX is now the premier space services operational provider now to U.S. government, U.S. corporates. There's no one else close. He's got it all to himself now, hasn't he?
He's got it pretty good. Well, they keep the Launch Alliance, the Space Launch Alliance, or whatever, the Boeing, the old school. They keep trying to keep them going because you do need some competition. But what amazes me? Okay, so SpaceX, awesome, just fantastic, and it's a new generation. But don't overlook Soyuz, mate. That thing's been plugging along since the '60s.
True,
and it doesn't fail.
No, it never does.
Yeah, I mean, occasionally they had that last one where the capsule had to ditch at 80 kilometers or something, but they made it back.
Yeah, that's true.
So hats off to the Russians. They've got that thing pretty nailed.
Yeah, but they don't have rockets to land back on the ground to get. I'm sure they could have, but the goalposts have moved so much that.
Mate, that is just unbelievable. And I don't think people appreciate it enough.
Interesting to see also that Virgin Galactic is finally kicking in with commercial flights. I remember actually talking face to face with Richard Branson about this at the Oshkosh Air Show. About his plans to, make the first commercial flights into, well, it's technically space, isn't it? I mean, it looks like space when you see the picture of it. They go, I think, how many kilometers up? 60, 65, something like that. 293,000 feet. It's a long way up.
It's space, yeah.
And he said, in a couple of years we'll be doing this. And how many years later? That was 2006. So 13 years later, I think they've had 2 commercial flights now. And it's taken this long, and I guess things like that always do take longer than you think. But it looks amazing, doesn't it? And it's all, again, now space tourism is all on. Yeah,
no, it does. It is. That's also pretty spectacular, yeah.
Oh, you can actually go weightless. It's incredible.
And, of course, you got the Amazon, the New Shepard. That's awesome as well. It's all happening, eh? It just shows you.
Yep.
I watched there's a visualization, and I'll put the link when I put the podcast up. There's a visualization showing over, I think, the last 25 years, the biggest companies in the US stock market. And it starts 25 years ago. It's like IBM, Gillette, Ford, Chevrolet, all these companies.
Yep.
And then what it does is every year the lines or the companies shift depending on their market capitalization, and it's pretty stagnant for like 15 years, and then suddenly out of the middle of nowhere, Apple, Google, Amazon, just bang, bang, bang. It's just, like Gillette was in the top 20 or top 10 or whatever it was for years and years and years, and suddenly all these companies just disappeared. It's just like overnight. GE, Gillette, gone.
And if you look at the market capitalization and the turnover of those new leading companies now, they're massive. It's like 100 billion.
Oh, yeah, Apple's like off the scale.
That's bigger than our country.
Yeah, oh, God, yeah.
It's incredible. So, and what about Elon Musk's Starship, that stainless steel thing? Have you been getting your head around that?
I have. That's interesting. It's going to use the weeping fuel system to keep it cool when it comes back, and why he went from carbon fiber to stainless steel. There's a really good YouTube channel called The Everyday Astronaut. Where he explains all of that in great detail. And it's everyone's saying it's a huge leap, but if anyone can do it, it's those guys. So don't knock it.
And if you're one of those guys, you never listen to people who say it can't be done. Ever. You never listen to them.
Absolutely.
Because there's plenty of those people around.
Shortly
we're going to hear from Steve Thomas, who's the grandson of Dave Thomas, who was one of the original 8 NAC 737 captains from 1968. He passed away a couple of years ago at the age of 90. I met Dave back in the 90s when I was making a program about the 737 in New Zealand. I interviewed him along with quite a few of the other old-time pilots, probably at least half of those original 8. And he was a really nice guy. And Steve has been following the Bring Our Birds Home campaign, particularly interested in obviously the 737, the former ZK NAD. And the family's been collating up material. Dave wrote a book recently. And Steve will join us at the end of our podcast here for about 25 minutes to take us through the career and experience of his granddad. The interesting thing is, and this is what happened, Martin, for guys of that generation who were in their teens pre-war and came into that whole war situation where they needed pilots, they needed to fill up air forces. Went out in the Pacific, flew Corsairs, came back and did the airline thing all the way through to basically the peak of the jets, seeing everything from string bag right through to, passenger jets. And he tells a good story, and particularly be listening out for his description one day of coming into Wellington on a beautiful day. It's just a beautiful description. So that's coming up. But first, I think we should update, unless you've got anything more you want to talk about, we should update Bring Our Birds Home.
Go for it.
Okay, so we've added another aircraft to the list. Martin, are you aware of that?
No, I'm not, Paul.
Okay, so, you're hearing this for the first time. We located the first Mount Cook Hawker Siddeley 748, delivered in 1968, ex-ZK-CWJ. That aircraft and the others that came along after it built the Queenstown, Wanaka, Mount Cook tourism industry. From very rudimentary right through to what it is, or what it got to be, I think, in the late 90s, early 2000s. So that is an artifact, again, of our transportation and tourism history, really. And that's at an airport derelict at the moment in Bangladesh. And we've talked to the airline, and they're happy to negotiate a price to sell. Probably won't get airborne again, but it's intact and missing a rudder and a few other things. The engines are still on it. And it looks in reasonable shape, even though it looks like it's been sitting out there for a while. It's converted into a cargo plane. So that's a cool thing. To discover that their very first one is still around, I mean, how can you ignore that? So we've got that in play. We've also come across an original NAC billboard from the 70s. I remember it used to be on the building, if you can remember Wellington, Martin, the Old Hut Road and where it goes up to Tinakori Road. So, and just before Thornton Quay, if you're coming that way. So not on the motorway, the other road up by the hill, and there's this big downtown storage building, what used to be a downtown storage. It used to be a furniture company, and this billboard was sitting there.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I remember going into town as a teenager on Friday night, driving past there and seeing that actual billboard. Now, I know it's that actual one because you won't believe it, from our former suburb of Eastbourne, an Eastbourne local who was cleaning out the basement of that furniture factory 20 years ago came across this full-size billboard in very good condition. He's alerted us to it. Now we're looking at bringing this billboard back as an electronic billboard for major advertising for the fundraising effort that we're going to have to do for ZK, NZC, NAD, and now CWJ. Of course, we've got a swap arrangement potentially with the DC-10. And we've also got a very brilliant person in advertising coming in on the team, someone who's run a very big advertising agency before, very experienced in marketing, whose father used to be he was one of the original 737 captains. So he's got skin in the game. That will start to make a difference at the end of March. We're just waiting. Again, we're having to be so patient and so adult about this. We're just waiting for that decision on the DC-8. We're told it's going to be positive. Once we know that we've got that, we can put out a fundraising target to our 3,500 supporters and anyone else who will listen to purchase those 3 airframes. I think we need to do it in that way, and that billboard hopefully will be part of it. So that's a great find, and the actual billboard itself will be heading to the museum in Wanaka and will be displayed in the next few months. So that's a good thing too.
Well, that's pretty good, yeah.
Yeah, so there's that.
Now, of course, the 748, you've got family history with the 748, isn't it? Because your dad flew back to Europe on one, didn't he?
He did, and I've got all the footage. He filmed it. He flew from Christchurch on ZKDES to Brisbane, and then up to Mount Isa, to Darwin, and up Indonesia, and all through, Singapore, and right up through as far as Nepal, and then, across all the way to London. It's all on videotape, and the footage is fantastic, and we're going to start playing some of that on the Bring Our Birds Home website. I also filmed the final day of operation of the 748 in Mount Cook service, and I've got footage of the whole day flying on that last day. So that's pretty special, and that's all shot on broadcast quality as it was back then, Betacam. So we'll be bringing some of that out. So we're getting ready to make the big play, and we're just having to wait for things to just the timing to work for us. But things are good. We're in good heart. People are supporting us. We've never had more interest or support or comments or views of videos on the various platforms we're on. So it's all going well. Everybody who has ownership of the airframes currently knows exactly our position. We've got great relationships with them. So I think it won't be too long. I keep saying this, but, I believe this. It won't be too long before we can really get out there and make the decisive move to satisfy the expectations and the hopes, really, of the supporter base out there. And when you hear this interview or this chat with Steve talking about his grandfather, you understand why it's important to preserve these memories. So, so it's in a good situation. And I'm looking out on our Give a Little page for that donation from you, Martin. I'm sure it's going to come.
Absolutely. I think I was the second person to donate.
Oh, were you? Oh, okay. Well, I must look back on because it logs everything. You see, it logs everything. We can tell. But
I think I was the second one.
Yeah, so we're going to also look at some innovative fundraising. Some people have offered ways of how they could be involved in fundraising. We got 500 flyers out around the Wings Over Wide at Upper Air Show before it was called off. And the local environs. Thanks to Nick for helping us out on that. So that was a good use of those flyers that we got printed. We've still got about another 1,000 left to put out there. They had all the donation details, bank account numbers, who to make checks to, where to go to donate on them. So, we're doing everything we can to get all this over the line, knowing that we don't have too much of a shot at it again if we don't get it right this time. Yeah, so I'd leave it at that. Really, that's the update.
I know. I hear you. I know what you're saying.
Anyway, so so we'll try and get another podcast together a bit quicker. Maybe not so much of a gap, but sometimes it really does depend on what everybody's doing. Now you're heading back to Australia, I think. So the next podcast you'll be beaming back in from Brisbane. Is that the idea?
back in Aussie.
Yeah. Brisbane?
Yeah,
Brizzy?
that'll be me. Yeah. It'll be Brizzy. Yeah.
All right. Well, good to talk again. And I feel like I've had a great opportunity to rant away on this podcast. That's what happens when you don't do them regularly enough.
You've done well, Paul.
Yeah, thank you, man. Yeah, you've
done well.
Used to it by now. Okay, probably a week or a week and a half away, we'll do another one. Oh, our next podcast guest will be Captain Canada. It's all locked in for that. So he's a busy guy. He's a busy guy. But
for YouTubers out there, if you're like the rest of us, or like us, Paul and I, we consume most of our moving pictures via YouTube these days. Captain Canada is definitely worth a watch.
Yeah, I'm looking forward.
Quite a thing he's got going there.
Looking forward to catching up with Captain Canada, the best-known virtual airline captain in the world, I'd say.
Yep, that's it.
Okay, that's to come. In the meantime, it's goodbye from me, and it's
goodbye from me. See you later.
Steve Thomas joins the New Zealand Aviation Podcast. Welcome, Steve. Nice to have you with us.
It's great to be here, Paul. Been looking forward to it.
And I got to say, I've met your grandfather, many years ago now, and he was a delightful person to meet and so interesting to interview. And I'm going to find that interview again. It's somewhere in the film library and bring it back and post it up all those years ago. And you must be like a proud grandson of a man who must have seen incredible change in the flying business, right, through his life.
That's exactly right, Paul. I mean, the thing I think about when I think of Dave, apart from him being a wonderful grandfather, very kind, generous person, is that he was a true pioneer of New Zealand aviation. He was there very much from the first days, the beginning days, when planes were very simple and mechanical things and very new things, very rare things in New Zealand before the Second World War. He grew up in Wellington and used to bike around Rongotai Airfield and think, wouldn't it be great to be able to be a pilot of one of these things and to go off and have adventures? And that's exactly what he did throughout all of his life. He flew during the Second World War and then became one of those very rare breed of people that got to pilot commercial airliners in the late 1940s and the early 1950s, when New Zealand's air domestic system was just getting established. Post-war, with Union Airways for a little while, and then the growth of the National Airways Corporation, or NAC, and then seeing the transition right through from those early piston-engined aircraft like the Lodestar, the Electra, and the DC-3, right up to the Boeing 737 jets, which were another technological marvel for their time.
It's quite a stretch. It's
sadly,
quite an arc, isn't it?
I was just going to say, sadly, I mean, one reason you're talking to me rather than him is that Dave sadly passed away in September 2016 at the right old age of about 90. So
wow.
He lived a very full life and got to see, I guess, the fruits of his work years afterwards through retirement and still keeping an eye on what was going on in the New Zealand aviation scene.
Like so many pilots of that era, the war loomed large, and I guess that would have, had a lot to do with the way they got on and the way they got on in their normal working lives when they returned to civilian service flying around the country. In this case, for the airline, there would have been a great camaraderie. So, what did he do in the war? And what sort of action was he in? What did he fly?
Well, Dave he turned 18 in October 1942, and I think he was really looking forward to that because he'd been at school. The war had been going on for about 3 years, and he really wanted to get into the Air Force and to fly. And so he joined up as soon as he could. As soon as he turned 18, he left school, and he was sent to Harewood in 1943 and did his training there on the Tiger Moth, and then just sort of gradually actually worked his way up through the ranks in the Air Force at that time. He had his first flight in May 1943, and he used to tell the story about his first flight. First time he went solo around the airfield, he just sang "I'm Dreaming of a White Christmas" at the top of his lungs. He was so excited about his first solo that's what he wanted to do. But rather than going off and joining the fighting in Europe or the Pacific straight away, the Air Force actually made him an instructor. And so he spent several months actually instructing other pilots, only a few months really after he had got his own wings, which I actually think is quite remarkable.
Yeah.
Probably because of the demands on people's time and resources. It's just something you probably had to do.
Yeah, they must have recognised him as a bit of a natural, maybe.
Well, actually, I was looking back at his logbook last year, and I actually noted at the end of his what must have been his basic flying training, they actually said that he had average ability, and I think that was an encouragement to him to become much better than average.
Right.
And that's something that he worked at through the rest of his flying career, and so. He would have been a good instructor, and he kept working towards his goal of being the best pilot that he could be. And so that after the instruction period was up and it was time for him to go and learn how to be a fighter pilot and a fighter bomber pilot, he kept developing his talents there. So he did training on P-40 Kitty Hawks at that stage, I think because they probably weren't so much on the front line by that stage of the war. He did his fighter training there, including learning how to do things like deflection shooting. And I've read his memoirs, and he talks a bit about how you had to reach certain score level to be competent.
Mm-hmm. Wait on, I got to ask, what is deflection shooting? Is it
sorry.
No, it's okay. But is it as it sounds, or is it what is it exactly?
Well, I'm talking about how you line up the fighter to shoot down something like a bomber. And I think in his book he talked about it basically like you're flying a gun, and you had to make sure that you got the gun lined up so that you could hit the aircraft from a particular angle as you were flying towards it, because both aircraft are moving, obviously, so you've got to know where to shoot so that you increase the chances of you actually hitting the airplane with your machine gun or your cannon. And doing that in a Harvard was actually really tricky because it only had one gun and a gun camera in the other wing. So that was one of the airplanes they trained on to do that. It was quite a feat. And if you were getting scores of, 17%, 25%, 30-something%, you're actually doing reasonably well. That's what he meant by that.
I often think about all that ammo that never hit. I mean, it's a silly thought, but never hit anything, because you hear figures like that, like with bombing raids, that only a relatively small percentage actually ever hit the target, yet they dropped masses of stuff. You can imagine how many rounds just flew into the air and dropped to the ground.
I have the same thoughts about flak.
And flak.
Bombers flying over Germany, all the flak and all the metal and shrapnel and stuff in the air, explosive. It's a lot of gunpowder and resource going up there. So Dave then went up to the Pacific around 1944. He did 2 tours, to answer your question about what action he was involved in. His first tour was up to Guadalcanal and Emerau with 23 Squadron, which I think was a newly formed squadron at the time. And their job was basically to go up and be a nuisance to the Japanese that had been sort of stranded and almost, if not completely, cut off from the main Japanese forces as the Americans were advancing through the islands. And so that's where he began his relationship with the Vought Corsair, which I think was probably ranks as one of his favourite aircraft.
Yeah.
He described it as a super Harvard.
Yeah.
Just because it was so beautiful, so big, so strong, and could do basically anything that he asked of it. A lot of the work he did up there by the end of the war was fighter bombing, and that's actually where he encountered some flak. He had a couple of missions going to straf Japanese emplacements that involved some quite low flying, and some Japanese gunners that were also aiming rather low and fast as well at his Corsair. In fact, he actually told an interesting story about this, that one day on one of these missions he was zooming back towards base at top speed, not very high above the water, and he saw what he thought to be flying fish, and he thought this was quite interesting. But those flying fish just kept appearing in front of the nose of his Corsair, and then he gradually realised, I don't think these are flying fish. I think they're shells, and they're just landing right in front of my airplane because the Japanese firing those shells haven't quite got their targeting right. Going back to what we were talking about before.
Yeah.
They'd aimed just a little bit too far in front of where they anticipated the aeroplane to be. So he considered that day quite a lucky escape. Fortunately for us and my family, it didn't get too much more dangerous than that for Dave in the Pacific, because we were here to tell the tale.
You would be telling the tale. On the Corsair...
No.
Sorry, but I was going to say, on the Corsair, I have read and also talked to a few old-timers a while back about who flew them as well. They could take a lot of punishment. They could get really heavily shot up and still fly. In fact, one guy I talked to had a round go through one of the cylinders, and it still carried on.
Yep.
No problem.
I believe that. I think the Americans definitely knew how to build big, sturdy fighter aircraft.
I think they were called the Whispering Death. Didn't the Japanese say that they were called them?
Yes.
Whispering Death.
Yes. So I think he was very happy to be in a Corsair rather than something else. And he was very sad, actually, when he finished the war and having to fly one of these things home on one of the long ferry flights back from the islands into, I think it was at the end of the war, they went into Whenapai, and then eventually they all ended up down at the graveyard.
Yeah, broken up.
Near Hamilton. Yep. Or just left to rot for many years and then broken up. So Dave spent several years in the Pacific, further refining his skills and loving every minute of it, doing around 243 hours, according to his logbook in the Corsair.
Wow.
But at the end of the war, the things actually weren't that certain, and particularly for pilots, because, as you can imagine, there's lots of pilots who now actually don't have jobs to go to. And for someone like my grandfather, flying was all he knew, and flying for the Air Force was the only thing that he had done. He didn't have a career to go back to like other people who had enlisted in the services did. So for him, there was actually quite a bit of uncertainty around late 1945 and into 1946 about what job could he do. And he had to work for a government department for a few months, which he absolutely hated, but had to do to pay the bills and to provide for his lovely new wife, Joni. Right. Which he'd named his Corsair after, of course, as all the young men did.
Great.
After their girlfriends or their wives. And so he had a few possibilities. One was to be a flying instructor with one of the Aero clubs, and another was to join Union Airways as a commercial captain, or the other one was to do what he had originally thinking of been doing before the war, and that was to go on I think it was one of these long short service commissions. That's right, that's what they're called, overseas with the RAF. As the story turned out, he managed to get a position on the flight crew with Union Airways, which is probably another feather in his cap, because there are probably even fewer people that have can say they've flown for Union Airways, which is the pre-war cursor to National Airways. And so he flew for them for a few months before it became National Airways Corporation in 1947, when the government legislated all the private airlines out of existed and combined them into National Airways.
Well, now they were starting with a bit of a ragtag bunch of aircraft too. There were de Havillands and Lockheed, I think a couple of Electras and maybe a few Lodestars, and it was sort of like a motley collection.
It was a motley crew, indeed. A modern economist at Air New Zealand would probably have a fit at the number of different aircraft types that NAC were operating in those very first days. And you're right, it was everything from the biplane Domini up to the DC-3, which was considered the most modern aircraft in the fleet at that time. And that eventually became the workhorse from the early 1950s, I think. Around about 1952, maybe 1953, all the NAC operations were standardised on the DC-3, except maybe a few very select services like down the west coast, where you still needed things like Dominis to get around. But Dave's first captaincy was actually of the Domini, flying out of Rongotai. It was only 6 passengers, and I think must have been quite a come down from flying something like a Corsair.
Oh, yeah, think about it.
Zipping along at several hundred miles per hour to going to a biplane Domini over Cook Strait. which is probably wasn't in hindsight probably wasn't the best aircraft to be operating.
Here's what it would be like.
Stretch of water.
Here's what it'd be like. It'd be like driving one of those old Morris 1100 land crab cars.
Oh yeah.
Versus some hot American sort of cool, hot rod. That with the roof down and the big steering wheel and the beautiful upholstery.
Yeah, and one day he actually had an incident with an engine where one of the cylinders, I think, shook loose. And fortunately it happened over land and he was able to turn back and land at Wellington, I think. But if it happened overseas, it might have been a different story. It had been fine all day, but just on that last flight that he was doing for the day, it just happened to have a pretty critical mechanical fault.
Wow.
And there's not much in the way of backup systems in a de Havilland Omni. I imagine it probably would be a very gradual descent into Cook Strait.
Yes.
was fully loaded.
I would say that I remember him talking about the Viscount, because I asked him about that. And that was in relation, I think I mentioned it last time in the podcast, but that it always stood out. I was asking him about how the 737 handled in Wellington, because I'm from Wellington, and I used to remember those. We used to go watch them come land on those hellishly windy days, And I asked him how it was, and he said the 737 handled Wellington without any problem at all. He said it was fantastic. But he says, I remember him saying, I had a really bad experience coming in one night in a Viscount, though. That's what he said. So...
Yep. Yes. Well, I heard your last podcast and I heard you make reference to it, so I made sure I actually looked it up in his memoirs to see if he actually talked about that, and fortunately he did.
Oh, great!
So I can give you a wee bit.
Oh, please.
I can give you a bit more of a blow-by-blow account of that.
Well, let's hear that now. I'm really keen to hear that.
Yeah. Well, and there's a bit of history involved in this too, because the navigational aids in those days weren't quite the same as what we have now. So these days, some sort of ILS, instrument landing system approach, is much more standard. But back in the days of the Viscount, they were still using EFL-based radar, and the controller would actually talk you down. It was called precision approach radar. And so that's how Dave was flying the approach on that particular night. It had been a very turbulent day during the day. Winds had been gusting around 60 to 70 knots. During the day, so if you can convert that to kilometres per hour, we're talking probably something in excess of 130, maybe up to 150 kilometres per hour or more. And he was flying at night on instruments. So it's not a good mix, really, for landing any sort of aircraft, let alone a commercial aircraft. So they were approaching runway 34, which is the southern runway, landing towards the north. So I presume it was probably one of those very gusty Wellington.
I think he indicated that it was, if my memory serves me.
Yeah. And so they were maintaining glide scope down, heading into a 74-knot wind. He found out later on, not at the time. Perhaps if he'd known that, he wouldn't have actually attempted the approach. But God bless him, he did. He recorded that the airspeed on approach was fluctuating by about 20 to 25 knots in the wind, so they were being buffeted about quite a lot, and the vertical speed was fluctuating by 1,000 feet per minute, which I'm sure you can appreciate is not a particularly safe situation to be in. So that was sort of heading down sort of around 3,000 to 2,000 feet. He managed to get below 1,000 feet, and he said that the winds got even worse from his feeling, and I think he decided at that approach it would probably be wiser to do a missed approach and divert to Palmerston North for the night, and then take the bus back to Wellington. I think his passengers were quite appreciative of that decision too. Apparently there'd been one other Viscount land slightly earlier than his. I think it might have come in from Christchurch, and they'd had a not quite as bad with the wind, but a similar experience coming through, and they just managed to get visual with the runway, and he thought it was better just to put the thing down, even though it was a bit slick and a bit wet.
Yeah,
a bit windy, rather than having to climb out of that very bad turbulence again. So there were a few days like that where it was pretty hairy with the Viscount and anything else really getting into Wellington. Although I do have to say his opinion of the Viscount, a bit like the 737, was that in most conditions that it was designed for, it did the job really, really well. Same with the Friendship as well. They all handled that Wellington weather extremely well. Provided it was operated within limits. That was his qualification.
Oh, that's really good.
So there you go.
Yeah, thank you for having
you've been enlightened on that
accurate
little
information.
episode.
Yeah, the accurate information.
Yeah.
Fantastic. And I know he did mention that he was impressed with and you mentioned it before we started talking, and we'll have that quote from him. He was impressed, wasn't he, with the way the 737 flew?
One thing Dave was very keen on was visual imagery, and he actually recorded his visual impressions of all the aircraft that he flew in his career, right from the Tiger Moth up to the 737. And he had this to say of the 737. And he says, "The picture I see when I think of the 737 is of a beautifully comfortable, streamlined, all-metal, fast and strong silver jet aircraft. That image is quickly followed by that of the view from the pilot's seat when I first taxied out to the end of the runway at Boeing in Seattle for my first takeoff. The 737 was smooth and responsive to anything that was asked of it. I really enjoyed every second spent in the 737. One of my lasting memories of flying that wonderful aircraft is of a particular approach and descent into Wellington Airport. It was not one of those awful days that Wellington can produce, but an absolutely perfect, clear, calm and sparkling day. On our descent north of Cook Strait and passing through about 10,000 feet, I could see all of Wellington and north of Kapiti Coast. I could see all of the Marlborough Sounds, Nelson, Blenheim and the Kaikoura Mountains. The sun was shining brightly on the scene, and there was not a cloud in the clear blue sky. It was just the perfect picture to remember as I guided my Silver Bird along the radar trail to touchdown at Wellington Airport. I have many other memories of the 737, but that descent into Wellington on that particular day is the most vivid for me." And I think elsewhere in the book he mentioned that day was the same day that Neil Armstrong landed on the moon.
Wow, that was great. So that was so good to hear that. Thank you. That captures it really well.
On that point, a great thing to note is that Dave was one of the first 8 captains.
That's right.
To get the chance to go over to Seattle and be trained by Boeing on the 737. And I mean, not only was that a big opportunity, there was actually a lot at stake for those guys too, because if they didn't pass, then they would actually have to spend, I guess, what was left of their career, most likely on the Viscount, but possibly on the Friendship as well, because they hadn't made that step from turboprop aircraft up to the complexity of the new jet aircraft. And it's worth noting that there were also a few NAC captains, either because they were reaching retirement or because they weren't confident enough that they could handle the jets, that they actually either couldn't take up or had to turn down that opportunity. It was sort of more the captains who were in their 40s or maybe their early 50s that got to do that very important job for the corporation. And there was a lot at stake for the corporation. They had to show that these new jet transports could work and do what was promised of them. And so he took that responsibility very, very seriously.
I went to Moses Lake because I know that Dave went to Moses Lake and trained actually on NAD, the aircraft that we're getting, that very aircraft.
Yep.
Very special plane.
So,
he would have flown that aircraft many times. He probably got his logbook, you can see.
Oh, well, actually, by that era, they seem to have stopped recording in the handwritten logbooks exactly all the hours. But on the 737 overall, I can tell you that he did 2,628 on 737 type. So that would have been between 1968 and 1978.
Yeah.
Most of that, of course, would have been in New Zealand, but some of that will be from the training in the States and also going and training pilots at some of the overseas airlines that NAC had contracts with, like South African Airways and I think FAT in Taiwan at the time.
Okay.
He was doing some training with one of their captains, and a left-hand tyre flew out on one of the main landing gears, and that was an interesting landing, which involved veering off the side of the runway. Yep. So he did all sorts. He delivered ZK BXF, one of the 100 series Friendships in 1961 from Amsterdam back to New Zealand. And also he did a Trans-Pacific delivery flight for one of the subsequent 737s that they bought from PSA.
Okay, NAL or K?
ZK NAK.
Yeah, K.
NAK.
Yeah.
NAK. Jay was a Boeing original.
That's right.
But K&L,
that was for Aloha, I think, Jay. A friend of mine was actually the guy who transferred the money to buy it. Simon Nixon was their accounts guy at the time. And they got that. It was an Aloha, and it was the last non-advanced. And they got it cheap. I think they got it for $1.3 million.
Oh, it's a bit like getting your old stock out of the store, isn't it?
Exactly.
All the new stock
comes
in. So one of the interesting jobs that the early pilots have to do, and pilots still get to do this today, is to actually go overseas and deliver an aircraft brand new from the factory to home. And so the first time Dave got to do this was in September 1961. He had to go all the way to Amsterdam to pick up one of the new NAC Fokker Friendships, the 100 series ZK BXF. And I always used to enjoy going out to the airport at Christchurch, and if I saw BXF, I thought, that's the aeroplane that my granddad delivered all the way from Amsterdam back to New Zealand, 20 plus years ago. And it's still here, and it's still flying around. Finished its days for Mount Cook Airlines, I think, at the very end. Yeah. Yep. In Mount Cook colours with the lily.
Yes, I remember that one.
So back in 61, though, they had to do this remarkable trip, starting, of course, in Amsterdam, then flying to Rome, on to Athens, Damascus, Bahrain, Karachi in India, Delhi, Calcutta, Bangkok, Saigon, Zamboanga, which I presume is probably in Indonesia, Biak, and then on to Darwin, Cloncurry, Brisbane, Norfolk Island, and then intended destination was Wellington, although I understand with that delivery flight, and also with a later one that he did on the 737, the weather was miserable at Wellington, so they had to divert elsewhere at the very end of the trip, having experienced fine weather on all the other legs.
Right.
But that was not just for the territory they covered. That trip was also quite eventful because they kept having problems with the engine fire alarm, which was, well, of course, a little bit disturbing, but also unusual for a brand new aeroplane that you would have this sort of problem coming up. Of course, there was no fire, and after a bit of investigation with the flight engineer, they found the cause was dampness in the engine fire sensing circuit that connecting plugs at the engine fire wall. So that was just a little niggle. And I think it may have persisted on in some of the Friendship fleet after that, little electrical problems like that. But that was one that occurred on the delivery flight. And he also spoke of this remarkable sight of seeing a dust storm between Damascus and Bahrain. This wasn't your everyday dust storm at the beach kind of storm. He reckoned this extended up to a height of about 6,000 feet.
Correct.
And they could see it clearly because they were cruising at 17,000 feet at the time. So that was a remarkable sight to see on that part of the trip. And then at the very end, he got to actually use some of his skills from way back in the war, doing those long over-water flights with the Corsair, because in those days Norfolk Island didn't have distance measuring equipment, nav aids, like all of the other modern airports had by this time. And so to keep track of their track, he had to actually devise a little air plot to work out where they were at different parts of the point, a bit like you would do these days with a GPS and your waypoints, marking where you were supposed to be off based on bearings. So I think he quite enjoyed that because he got to apply his skills that he'd learned from earlier on, like they used to do in the bows and arrows days.
Yeah.
So that was a pretty eventful trip. And then the other delivery flight that he was involved in was bringing one of the latter 737s back all the way across the Pacific Ocean from California. So he and some of the other pilots were involved in bringing ZK NAK back in. That was in 1973, September 1973, in fact. And there's a funny story attached to that delivery flight too, which probably isn't very well known because you would have had to be there to see it. But all the top brass at Pacific Southwest Airlines, which was the airline that NAC had bought that 737 from, second hand, they actually turned up at the airport that day to see the NAC crew off, which was a very kind thing to do, so Dave thought. But unfortunately, on the day of departure, rather than getting a direct departure out of the airfield that they were leaving from, they actually had to to do a long diversionary climb out of the aerodrome because of, I think, some American fighter jets in the area. But Dave, in his foresight, had planned for the standard departure, but he hadn't counted on the fact that there could be a change to those plans. So he had to quickly redo the departure flight plan and get it logged, which held up everything on the ground. And I think the dignitaries from PSA was left sort of standing around wondering why the 737 wasn't going anywhere. So there were little tricks like that to the trip, besides the navigation and the complexities of taking a short-haul 737 all the way over the Pacific Ocean. Because in those days, the 737 didn't have the legs that it does now, where it can fly for quite long distances over long expanses of water. In those days, they had to fit the high-frequency radio and all the nav aids for those sorts of flights, and also the internal fuel tanks. So they would rip out all the passenger seats and put in these either rubber fuel bladders or big drums, big fuel cans in the cabin to feed into the airplane's fuel system. So that was a big exercise, and Dave had to plan quite hard for that trip ahead of time to make sure it was executed well. And with the winds that you can get over the Pacific too, that can have a big impact on how long your sector actually is. One leg he'd planned to Honolulu, I think from Honolulu to Nandi, it turned out to be about 7 hours rather than 6 hours. So they were very.
That's a long way in that aircraft.
To get right.
Long way.
Yeah, I know. And he actually reflected on that afterwards and thought, I'm actually quite glad I do short haul flying, because I'm not sure I'd enjoy doing these long overwater flights day in, day out. At least in the aircraft of the day. It might be a different story these days with the modern aircraft, and where the aircraft can pretty much fly itself from one point to another as long as the autopilot's programmed correctly. But to do a lot of the calculations and the work around fuel and waypoints manually, and to get it done correctly was quite a lot of work.
Wow, it would have been an adventure doing one of those flights. I think they went out of San Diego for PSA, wasn't it? I think they were based there.
That sounds about right, yeah, because they were based on the
Lindbergh
West
Field.
Coast in California.
Lindbergh Field, I think, is the name of the airfield.
Yeah.
Well, that's quite...
I should have checked that.
Oh, no, it's okay. It's fine.
Yeah.
I've seen a few photos of those aircraft, waiting for NAC to take them. I think they flew them back still in the colours of PSA.
Yeah, so there were pictures in Dave's logbook of NAK and PSA colours, and the distinctive thing about their livery at the time was that it had this black stripe under the nose. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, the smile.
Where it looked like the smile, yeah. I think their slogan might have been something like we're the friendly airline, or PSA, fly the friendly airline, or the friendly skies, something to that effect. And it just sort of added to the effect, because I always used to think the 737s with the black nose, it looked a bit like they had a real nose, like a human nose.
Well, I
on
think
the front. It gave them a bit of character.
If you look at some of those photos of those, I don't know which aircraft it is, either of those two. Someone's put a little kiwi on it too. They've painted a little kiwi on the. If you look at
on the PSA one.
Yeah, right on the nose, or just under the cockpit windows, a little kiwi. Okay. Yeah. So I don't know who would have done that.
I hadn't noticed that before.
Yeah, if you look hard, I think you'll find it somewhere. It depends on which aircraft, though. I can't remember which exact one of the two it was.
Yeah. Maybe it was the PSA guys, because they seem to have gone some trouble to at least give NAK a good send-off. So perhaps that was part of the ceremony.
I would say that was it.
Now, the handover.
Was Warren Schrader, because I talked to Warren Schrader, he delivered one of those. I don't know if it was NAK or L, but was that with Dave, or was that the other plane? I wonder.
I have a feeling he was with Pete Buck on that one.
Yeah.
Yes, here we go. Yeah, I've got it there. The crew for the trip home was Peter Buck, myself, Jim Walker, and a navigator from Air New Zealand. So there you go.
But he quit or stopped just as the merger was about to happen, because that was 1978.
Yeah, so again, I guess history and circumstances intervened to a degree in his career, because back in those days, pilots actually retired from flying a lot younger than what we're used to today. The age was 55. To keep flying for a little bit longer, they've actually worked quite hard with NAC management before the merger took place to become what I believe is the first simulator captain. His last role was as a chief check and training captain, And so he had a bit of clout, I guess, within the company to arrange this so that he could continue to fly on past that age of 55, but on the ground, just by supervising the training of other 737 captains exclusively in the simulator. But in order to do that, he had to stop flying the actual aircraft earlier so that NAC could guarantee he would be in that position at the time the merger took effect in April 1978.
Right.
So that was actually a really hard decision for him, because he had to give up flying probably a little bit earlier than he really wanted to, but it then secured several more years of what in effect was flying just like flying in the aeroplane, but being based on the ground. So for the time, it was actually quite an innovative thing to do. Yeah.
And the simulator
was a nice way for him to end his career.
Simulator was based in Christchurch back then, wasn't it?
Yeah, so at that time, the 737 and the Friendship simulators were based in Christchurch, and they stayed in Christchurch until 1983, when they moved to Auckland. And it was at that point that Dave formally retired from Air New Zealand at that point, because he was basically at retirement age by that time. To keep doing what he was doing would have meant moving to Auckland. I think he just saw that as the right time to bow out when that change happened. Of course, the Christchurch operation is a hangover from the NAC days where that was the base for the 737 crews. In a funny roundabout way, I actually owe my own existence to that, because if the Thomas family hadn't moved from Wellington to Christchurch when the 737 operation became based at Christchurch, my father wouldn't have met my mother. So that's my own little special link in the way to the 737 for me, which is also why I'm very, very interested in making sure ZK NAD gets back to New Zealand, because it's an artifact that has special significance for me because of the links to my family, not just what it represents to New Zealand air transport, as well. So I've been gunning for you ever since I heard of the campaign.
Thank you.
A couple of years ago.
Yeah, well, we're
doing whatever I can to support it.
We've got a lot of support now, a lot of people behind the thing. It's taken a while to get to that level, but it was always going to, because you have to have support. But we're in a better position than we were, put it that way, and getting better all the time. I mean, when I say than we were, it was vulnerable. Anything could have happened. But at least it's that's been put on hold. So thank you for your support, and it's great to hear. It's great to hear Dave's story, but it's also good to hear how it fits in. Those were really pioneering days. That change that NAC made to those aircraft, that changed the nation. It did, didn't it? It made the country really small for a start.
Yeah, exactly. It shrunk
big time
travel times. From taking maybe a couple of days to get from one end of the country to another, let alone being able to do a day's business. Basically being able to get between Auckland and Christchurch, or Auckland and Dunedin, back and forth pretty much within a day, and that's nothing to be sneezed at. And Dave's contribution was to help get all those people from one place to another safely. I think that was the thing he prided himself on most, was that he was a safe pilot.
Steve, thank you for sharing all that with us. It's fascinating. It's like, walk down memory lane.
Time capsule.
I was going to say, walk down memory lane's a bit lame. It's way more than that. Yeah, time capsule. That's a great way of putting it. And it was great to hear that. I'm sure our listeners will really enjoy those stories and walking through history like that. And thank you for supporting Bring Our Birds Home. And we really do want to get that aircraft back. I think we're going to have a good shot at it. And it's going to be it's for everyone, but it'll certainly be in the memory of people like Dave and all those guys and everybody involved in making that airline work during that era, which was, for Dave, most of it was the whole stretch, really, wasn't it?
It was, all the way through NAC's history. He flew for the airline, took pride in the airline, and like many people who work for it, it was not just a company, it was a family.
Sure was.
That they were committed to working for, even working in the early days on their days off, make the thing work on occasion. Can't see that happening today, but that's what happened. Just going to say, hey, I'm looking forward to the day when NAD is back and it's fully restored down in Wanaka. And, it'd be great to be there on the day that it's opened as an attraction.
Wouldn't
for
it
the
be
public.
amazing? Yeah.
just to remember and honour those days, and again the contribution that Dave and his colleagues made to New Zealand aviation and building our country.
Indeed. And thank you, Steve Thomas, grandson of Dave Thomas, Captain Dave Thomas, one of the first 8 NAC 737 captains from 1968. And I say again, it's in memory of Dave and all the other people that worked with Dave to make that airline work and to make those 737s what they were, changing this nation, shrinking this country, and of course, the only remaining original ZK-NAD, one of the Bring Our Birds Home airframes, sitting in North Carolina and hopefully not too far away on display to the public in some form or fully restored. We'll have to wait and see at the Transport and Toy Museum in Wanaka.